everyone, and welcome to today's webinar sponsored by the High Bar Research Alliance, also known as the HRA. I'm Lori Van Egren from Michigan State University, and I'll be the moderator of today's one-hour event. This is the 18th webinar in our series of webinars for researchers, research administrators, and others who are interested in what we call highly integrative, basic, and responsive research. Our previous webinars are available for viewing on the HRE website, which can be found at highbar-research.org. Before our featured presentation by Dr. Michael Doherty, I'd like to explain the structure of today's meeting. We'll begin with a brief overview of the High Bar research concept by Lauren Whitehead. Next, Michael Doherty will speak about aligning open science with promotion and tenure guidelines, and specifically the University of Maryland's Department of Psychology's process for approximately 20 minutes. Now, let's get started. First, please welcome Lauren Whitehead, Director of the High Bar Research Alliance and Professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of British Columbia, to provide an overview of High Bar.
Thank you very much, Lori. I'll be quite brief today. It's certainly a pleasure to present a few ideas about the High Bar Research Alliance and High Bar research projects in particular. Now, High Bar research projects embrace two key dualities. First, they integrate academic leadership with societal leadership, and that creates cognitive diversity that fuels successful innovation. The second duality is they integrate academic purpose with societal purpose, and that creates new knowledge while applying it to practical challenges. So those are four very big ideas: academic leadership, societal leadership, academic purpose, and societal purpose. And it's a lot to hold them in one's head simultaneously, but they do go together. And sometimes we use other words to try to describe that idea. For example, we could use the words highly integrative to indicate that a whole bunch of disparate ideas are present simultaneously as listed here. And we also use the words basic and responsive to emphasize basic as in basic research, which High Bar research is, but also responsive as responding to not just the needs of society, but input from leaders in society. So those ideas all go together quite well. And particularly those descriptors that you see in those rectangles, we think of them as lenses for describing and understanding research. And where those lenses intersect, that's where High Bar research lies. So it's in the sea, the massive world of research, it's a little concentrated area that has all of these characteristics at the same time. And that's useful for two reasons. First of all, the fact that it's a narrow definition means that it is possible for people who care about it to emphasize it, to focus effort on it with great effect. So the narrowness is a benefit for sure. But why do so? Is this an academic exercise? No, it's a practical exercise. Historically, High Bar research has correlated with significant impact in society. There's nothing new about this idea at all. That's maybe a new label, but it's ideas for work that has taken place for a very long time at many universities with these characteristics. The idea, though, is that perhaps we could do more of it or learn how to do it better. So that's what the High Bar Research Alliance is about. It's an organization with a mission to do what I've just said. It is a distributed, organized network of experienced volunteers who are united in their support of High Bar research projects of all forms. It's a very wide net. And collectively, we aim to increase the rate of High Bar research projects from currently about one project in 20 universities today to about 1 in 5, so a lot more by the year 2030, while improving all kinds of research. We're not aware of any kind of research that would be hurt by the advance of the type that we're describing here because of the nature of High Bar research. And this will help universities respond more effectively to societal needs while increasing the overall excellence of their diverse research portfolios. Now, achieving any change in the university system requires some adjustments in academic culture. And changing academic culture, of course, as you know, is a very important topic for today. So our presentation today will be focusing on a really exciting change initiative at the University of Maryland's Department of Psychology. Their culture has been changed to better recognize the value of open science in tenure and promotion decisions. And this is a great example, of, at least in my opinion, of a change initiative with dual benefits. In this case, directly encouraging the modern practices of open science and also making the promotion and tenure system just fairer and better, which I find very inspiring. So, Laurie, on that note, I'd very much like to hand back to you to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Lauren. So I'm very pleased to introduce today's presenter, Michael Doherty. Mike's a professor in the Department of Psychology and chair of the Department of Psychology at the University of Maryland, College Park. He championed and led a multi-year effort to develop and implement new guidelines that explicitly codify open science as a core criteria in tenure and promotion review. He'll describe the approach that was taken to adopt the new policy, aimed at empowering faculty members to do research in the way they want to do it and on topics that energize them. Mike, you can take it away.
Thank you very much, Laurie, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. What I'm going to talk about is actually maybe even broader than open science, and I'll give you some sort of motivation for why we've kicked this effort off here in a few seconds. A few things I want to point to, though, are if you're interested in taking a look at our policies, you can find them on our website. I'll provide some other links elsewhere in this presentation, I think. We also have a fairly substantial repository I created that has where we've collated a lot of resources for people who are interested in exploring ways that they can reform policies in their own departments as well. So you can find that on the OSF Open Science Framework address here at the bottom. So I was told to keep this fairly brief. So, how about we start with some summary slides? So again, what we undertook at Maryland was basically what I would call a reform effort aimed at overhauling the way we evaluate faculty. The biggest change, most substantive change is for tenure and promotion, but we also underwent reform efforts for our annual and merit review, reform efforts for how we a funding initiative that I created that supports and aligns with the values that are sort of interwoven throughout our policies, as well as new awards that we're rolling out this semester that support the very same behaviors that we're trying to reward in our tenure and promotion. So I think it's useful to start out here with a summary, both because some of you may have to leave early, may fall asleep. So we can get some of the benefits or some of the main points here out of the way up front. So one thing I learned from this endeavor is that faculty want to do the right thing. So early on in this process, I actually discovered that many of my faculty were, I think, having internal struggles about where to publish their work. On the one hand, they were looking at promotion criteria and saying to themselves, well, I need to publish in a journal with a high impact factor. On the other hand, they were simultaneously thinking, but I want to make that work accessible to the public. And so some of my faculty were having this internal dialogue, a struggle, if you will, about how they were going to promote and publish their own work. And their behaviors were guided by the promotion policies, right? And in some ways, in direct contrast to what they felt was the right thing to do. Many of my faculty were, of course, choosing the right thing to do, and they were, choosing to publish an open access journal so the communities could get access to it. But the fact that they were having an internal struggle, I think, speaks volume to the power of the incentive systems for driving faculty behavior. Another thing that I found was that after we went through this effort, many faculty were excited to be able to pursue new projects with the community. Faculty came forward to apply for funding for some of our initiatives that I would have never guessed would have applied or been interested in the topics. And other faculty just thanked me, recognizing that this was long overdue and something that we really need to do. The next big thing I learned was that, we've been doing it the same way for so long that faculty have a hard time imagining something different, right? I've been at the University of Maryland for, I think, 23 years now. We've been using the same promotion criteria since the time I've been here. Faculty are just accustomed to doing things in a particular way. And so it took some time and effort to socialize and educate the faculty so that A, they understood maybe the way we've done things in the past historically weren't optimal, and maybe actually detrimental to what we were trying to achieve as a discipline and as a university. The fourth thing here is that intentionality and persistence were key, that I didn't just walk into a room and say, hey, we're going to overhaul these policies, show people what we're going to do, and have everybody sign off. It took a long time. It was literally about a 5-year process. The majority of that was socializing and educating faculty. And then the last thing, which this is the I think the most refreshing, and for some people maybe this most surprising, is that administrators are totally open. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, not just from the University of Maryland administrators, but administrators elsewhere, that they're very open to new ways of doing things. And in fact, many administrators are reorienting themselves toward the original land grant institutions upon which many of our institutions were founded, and the core values that go along with that mission, which are, quite frankly, to serve the communities inherent in our states, in our nation, and quite frankly, across the globe. Okay, so let me get to some specifics here. So I'm going to try to address 3 main questions, and I'm going to try to keep this within the time frame allotted. But the 3 main questions are: why did we undertake the reform efforts? What did we do? And then what strategies did I use to maximize success in my own department? I'm not going to say or claim that I'm going to provide you a recipe for success, but I can share what I did and what I felt helped make this process go smoothly in my own department. Over here on the right-hand side of the slide is a figure I pulled from a paper that a few colleagues and I wrote in about 2019. And in that paper, we had envisioned an alignment between the institutional values, and that includes the disciplinary values, the values of the university, the values of the academy, the values that individual researchers embrace as part of their own research. So why they got into this business in the first place, what they hope to accomplish as an academic and as a researcher, but then also an alignment component that involves how we report our scholarship. And so one of the things we recognized, my colleagues, James Grant and Bob Slevick, is that curriculum CVs are notoriously impoverished. They don't provide a lot of information. They provide a list of publications upon which what we can do is basically count, right? So they encourage things like counting, bean counting, but they don't really provide much context about what goes into that research, right? We make judgments based on numbers. We make judgments based on impact factors or where something is published, but we oftentimes don't really bother to dig into every single paper that our colleagues are writing. It's a lot of work to do when you're evaluating faculty. So we envisioned a new way of reporting in our department that we've adopted. To me, it really makes a lot of sense that we can now not only talk about transparent research, but transparent reporting of the research that we do on our CVs in the evaluation context. Okay, so why did we undertake these reforms? Well, as Lori mentioned, I'm in psychology, and for those of you in the social sciences and maybe even well beyond, you'll recognize that we have a pile of dirty laundry out there for everybody to see. What does that dirty laundry look like? Well, I gathered a set of headlines earlier today that sort of documents what some of that dirty laundry looks like. And this stuff has been in the news for now over 10 years. Starting in the right-hand corner is one of the sort of watershed moments in our field. A Dutch researcher named Dietrich Stoppel was busted for fraud, making up data, tweaking data, engaging in questionable research practices to the tune of tens, maybe over 20 or 30 papers that ultimately ended up being retracted. I actually lost count and haven't looked recently. That, coupled with some other things that came out about the same time in our field, I think really prompted people in our field to look inward to why it is that these cases of fraud, it wasn't just one, were coming forward, and what the research practices we were engaging in that might undermine the credibility of our own research. And so this is just a smattering. These are all independent headlines of independent cases that have come forth. And they're not all psychology, right? Some of them are more recent, others are farther back. But these issues about incentives and reproducibility and replicability, unfortunately, likely affect many of our disciplines in the academy. Okay, so why did we undertake the reform efforts? Well, one of the reasons that we felt that was really necessary, and this was really the initiating event, was we felt that there was a need to incentivize research integrity, transparency, reproducibility, and to do something to promote trust in science. Now, obviously, we're just one department. We're not going to do this on our own, but we figure everybody has a stake in this, and someone needs to take the step forward to put a change in motion so that we can all move towards a more trustworthy science and scholarship. The second major issue is this realization that there's this misalignment between what we say we value and what is rewarded. If you look at tenure and promotion documents, many of the things that are inherent in those documents are things like productivity, contribution to science, sometimes rigor, visibility, reputation, like gaining an international reputation or a national reputation, obtaining prestigious awards. Well, these are all fine and good, but they don't really speak to the core values of the university, right? So one of the core missions of the university is to better society. And although those things don't hurt society necessarily, they don't really speak directly to the things that university mission statements really say that the universities are all about. And so there's this misalignment. I'll give you some concrete examples in a minute. And the third thing here is that if you start digging into some of the things that we use in our promotion criteria, like bibliometrics, citation factors, or impact factors, you'll find that there's a lot of literature that suggests that maybe we shouldn't be doing that. I'll review a few of those pieces of literature here in a few minutes. So this realization that commonly used metrics are problematic, and if we can't rely on those commonly used metrics for the reasons that we thought we could, then we need to do something different. Okay, so what about this misalignment between values and rewards? As I said, university mission statements oftentimes tout importance of community, public engagement, and working for the public good. But if you look at promotion guidelines, oftentimes these words appear in conjunction with the service category, right? So we think about, well, doing work in the community is really about outreach. It's a service obligation, right? Or public engagement is sharing your knowledge to a local community, working at a community center. Oftentimes, when we talk about community, public engagement, public good, these are associated in the actual promotion documents with the service category. And what we know about the service category is that it's the least heavily weighted of the three legs of the stool. So even if people are engaging in these activities, and even if they're in promotion documents, they probably aren't receiving the amount of attention that maybe they deserve. And we would argue, or I would argue, and I think this is consistent with the high bar network, is that much of what we do and could do in our research and teaching involves or could involve the community, it could involve the public, and certainly is geared towards the public good. And these features of our research and these features of our teaching can be brought more forcefully into our evaluative systems. So let me just give you a concrete example of how not a university value, but maybe an individual value can conflict with the behaviors that we incentivize, okay? On the one hand, universities say they want to solve societal problems. Well, there's no bigger societal problem right now. Well, actually, there's a lot of big ones. So it's hard to pinpoint what the biggest one is, but climate change is amongst the most salient and largest and most significant challenges that our society will face in the next 50, 100, 200 years. It's a whopper, right? And if I truly recognize that as a societal problem, internally, I might be thinking, I really should be doing something to reduce my carbon footprint, right? What can I do to to contribute to solving this societal problem. Even if I can't do the science, maybe I can do something personally. So internally, my values are telling me reduce my carbon footprint. If I look on the reward system side, right, we oftentimes talk about young faculty especially need to be visible. They need to attend conferences. They need to get out, network. They need to make a name for themselves, form that, help sort of cultivate that reputation, that international reputation or national reputation. Well, this ultimately means attending conferences, right? This is one of the big ways that we tell our young faculty and older faculty even to cultivate their image. Well, that comes at a cost, right? If I need to attend a conference, that usually means hopping on a plane and flying across the country, maybe even flying overseas, to the tune of tons and tons of carbon emission, right? So here I am, I have this value that I should reduce my carbon footprint, right? Internally, I'm thinking I should do this. On the other hand, the incentive system is saying, well, maybe put that on hold until you get promoted, right? And so this conflict between our social responsibilities and incentives can, it forces individual faculty, individual people to make decisions that, might conflict with their internal values. And I think this is problematic and maybe not as widely thought about in this incentive system. It's not just about sort of the public good, but, what part of that public good we're trying to contribute to. I mentioned earlier problems with traditional metrics. I'm just going to show two main things here. One is that there is a lot of data now that shows that there are citation disparities between men and women. This particular paper that came out about a year ago shows not just disparities between men and women, but also disparities amongst different racial ethnic groups. If you're a Caucasian, white male, you benefit from this. On the other hand, if you are multiracial or from an underserved group and you're female, you're feeling the brunt of this. And so you can think about these, one problematic aspect of the use of things like impact factors, or not, in this case, I guess, citation counts, is they can potentially cause adverse impact, right? So if we're using citation counts as a key indicator of someone's visibility or productivity or impact, well, we're also simultaneously selecting on these other correlated variables. Okay, so useful to think about this. It's not just a social science thing, by the way. You find citation disparities across most of the disciplines that I've looked at. So that's one thing. The second thing is that, we typically think about impact factors and citations as reflecting some aspect of quality. Well, the data just don't support it. Okay, I'm not going to go into each one of these things, but highly novel research tends to show up in journals with lower impact factors. Higher impact factors tend to have more replication problems than lower impact factor papers. And this last slide, the third panel on this, shows that papers that ultimately are not replicable tend to have citation advantages over papers that are replicable. This is a paper that came out, I think, in the last year or two. And this is just one nugget from that paper. So there's a lot more to explore in that particular domain. So not only are metrics sometimes detrimental for the purposes of causing adverse impact, they don't even measure what we think they might measure, right? They aren't measures of quality or impact. So just to summarize here, why did we undertake these efforts? Well, bottom line, we felt necessary. There's a need to build a more trustworthy and reproducible science. We felt that research had changed sufficiently that it was time to revisit our criteria anyway. Research is now more collaborative. It's we have many more multi-authorship papers. Many more people are relying on secondary data. All these things are becoming more normative. Another key thing, and I think this is really where things start to hit home, is, many of our young faculty, I'm finding, are really interested in having an actual impact. It's not just, in theory, my work could have an impact. Like, they are literally interested in solving real world problems. Oftentimes, these are real world problems that are in very circumscribed communities. Maybe it's a local community. Maybe it's an immigrant community. Maybe it's some subpopulation of the United States or the world the point here is that we're recruiting faculty in because they were interested in these problems. And then they're walking into an incentive system in which those types, that type of research isn't necessarily explicitly incentivized. And so it's almost as if we're telling them, we like what you do, but don't do that for a couple of years, not until you get tenure. And there's just something disingenuous about that. The fourth point here, more broader recognition that the system is broken. I'm not going to go into all those issues. I've already mentioned the problems with the metrics. And then here, the key one here, and I think this really was highlighted by Lauren, that universities, I think, are really reorienting themselves around values. This isn't just a Maryland thing. This has certainly been something that has been omnipresent at Maryland for the last few years. But my sense is that many administrators are really starting to take a hard look at what it is that universities are doing, what our core mission is, and really returning to our roots of why we were founded in the first place. Okay, so now on to what did we do? You can reframe this question as, if we were to start from scratch and to develop a new evaluation system today, knowing what we know about the world, what would it look like? And this was literally the framing I took to my faculty. Like, there's nothing special about the way we've done stuff before. The only thing special about it is that we've done it before. But that shouldn't be justification for carrying forth with something that has problems, serious problems. Many of you are probably familiar with Goodhart's law, and Goodhart's law is simply when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good target, right? So the measure itself is no longer a measure of the thing that it was initially constructed to be once people start to game it. So the question we really started with was, well, how can we develop an incentive system in which, if people are going to game, and they will, okay, we recognize that faculty are going to game, but what if we had an incentive system that when they did the gaming, it resulted in pro-social behavior, right? In other words, maybe if we could get them to game the stuff that our university values are about, that might be useful for moving our societal issues forward. And a key point here is, of course, policies, in particular tenure and promotion policies, codify these incentives. So what might we want our faculty to game? Well, maybe we want them to game inclusiveness, right? Inclusiveness in terms of who can participate in science, but who has access to science, right? That use-inspired science. We might want them to game high-quality reproducible research. Wouldn't it be nice if people forefronted reproducibility such that when something made it into the news, we didn't have a retraction 3 or 4 years later, right? That would be fantastic. Maybe it would be great if they gained the societal benefit, right? Trying to really explicitly link their basic research to the applied problem and driving towards those applied solutions. Not that everybody has to have, a direct applied context, right? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we could make it okay for people to pursue these problems that will have societal benefits and reward them for doing it. We might want to have people game engagement with the community, make it more rewarding to do so, game enhanced accessibility, improved accessibility of the science to diverse communities in the scientific community, and of course, acceleration of science, right? If we could get people to engage in behaviors that are going to move the scientific field forward more rapidly, this would be to the benefit of all of us. So more concretely, what we did in my department was to really do a full-scale overhaul of our entire incentive system. And this started with reframing the way we described our jobs. So our job ads changed. We now include an emphasis on open science and transparency. As a department chair, I could pull some extra levers. So for example, and this is all part of communicating these values, by the way, I require that all of my new faculty have open access funds as part of their startup funds. It's a line item I put in there and they can't negotiate out of it. So I give them more money basically for that particular purpose. We overhauled our annual and merit review process so that the things that we are reviewing and providing feedback on and measuring at that annual process are mutually supportive of our promotion and tenure process. So there's a lot of overlap in the things we're looking at between our annual review and our promotion review. I created an internal funding mechanism where I set aside funds to support open education resource development, open science process development, community engaged research, and several other things to promote broadening participation in psychological sciences. And then recently we've started to roll out some new awards to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as open science practices. The point here is that we wanted to build consistency across all these different components of the evaluative system so that people aren't sort of bouncing back and forth between trying to satisfy different criteria for different purposes. The other thing we did is we really wanted to focus on behaviors rather than outcomes. Many of the things that we engage in, many of the things that we oftentimes measure, I would call outcome-based measures. There's not necessarily something wrong with outcome-based measures, but oftentimes we don't have control over those outcomes, right? As a young faculty member, when I submit a paper, the only thing I have control over is the work that I put into that paper. Once it goes out into the journal, then I'm at the mercy of some number of reviewers who may or may not even be aware of the area of research that I'm publishing in, and may or may not actually take much time to actually read the paper before providing feedback. I think we've all had that experience where we're like, what? I can provide more data on that issue as well, the lack of agreement between reviewers. But again, we wanted to focus on the behaviors, not too heavily on the outcomes, and of course, build consistency. Some key features of what we've achieved. One thing is we wanted to enable pathways to tenure, not prevent them. So much of the way we framed our revision was through this lens of there are many ways that you could show value. And there are many ways, therefore, that you can envision yourself meeting criteria for promotion. We aren't lowering the bar, but what we're doing is saying there's many ways to meet that bar. The criteria focus on values, and they're infused throughout our documents. There's a heavy focus on social justice, broadly defined, and psychological science. There's been some recent revelations, probably not to the surprise of many people, but maybe surprise of some. For example, much of psychological science has excluded a focus on underrepresented groups. And what we wanted to do was to make sure that if people are doing work on issues or with populations that involve underrepresented groups, that this was both supported and rewarded, and that we recognize that that type of participatory work sometimes takes much longer to curate than other types of work. So we wanted to make sure that there was explicit mention of those challenges that people might face doing different types of work. Our policies and criteria envision an important role for transparency and openness, again, in the spirit of rewarding and supporting reproducibility and transparency. I mentioned this earlier, I'll show you an example in a bit. We use an annotated curriculum vitae format that really expands what's reported on one CV. As part of that, we also recognize the value all the works that people develop. So, usually we look at the end product and we say, you published a 13-page paper. Great job. But what we don't recognize is that someone may have developed a lot of really cool research tools. They may have curated a very useful data set. And these are products that we also wanted to recognize as part of our holistic evaluation of faculty. We eliminated impact factors and citations. This I view as like a huge success. Just very pleased that that my faculty ultimately said, you know what, you're right. We can't really rely on these as valid indicators. Number 8, we wanted to empower intellectual risk taking, not inhibit it. Incremental work, nothing wrong with incremental work. But if people are going to tackle huge societal problems, sometimes it's going to require taking a few risks. And we need to make sure that they aren't penalized for taking those risks. And then finally, and I think this is really what sums up everything. And you'll see this if you open up our criteria, you'll see that there's a huge focus on substance over quantity. You'll see the word substance used throughout our document, really to orient people to the fact that we want to focus on the substance of the work products, not on the quantity of the work products. A few useful observations to share too, in case you're wondering. I was nervous when I first put this thing out to vote, but we came back 27-0, completely unanimous across all of our faculty in getting this policy passed. Faculty have come to me and said, yeah, I can see a clearer path to tenure. I understand what I need to do now. Many faculty thanked me. And one component, I didn't mention this, is many of our sort of mid-career faculty end up getting put into things like associate chair roles or directors of clinical training that require a substantive time commitment. These are huge service obligations. And what we wanted to do was really forefront that to say, look, this is tough. You're being put in a place where you have to sacrifice something, and likely your research is going to take a hit. So we wanted to make sure that we were recognizing and valuing those important shared governance roles. And then finally, I already mentioned this, but the dean, associate provost were really supportive of our efforts. I'm going to cruise through here pretty quickly, but I just want to point out a couple of example criteria. So the third one down focuses on research that addresses gaps in the literature as they pertain to historically underrepresented groups. This is literally pulled straight from our criteria. The values that this is associated with are diversity and inclusion. Typically, when I think of diversity and inclusion and the way people tend to think of it, it's in that service category. Here, what we've done is we've explicitly put things related to activities and behaviors related to diversity and inclusion into our research evaluation process. The last one on here pertains to rigor and integrity. And what we have here is evidence of adhering to standards of conducting transparent, ethically sound, and reproducible research. So you might ask, well, how do you document behaviors like this, right? Where do they show up? And one of the complaints we oftentimes see is that people worry about invisible labor. Well, there's ways that we can make invisible labor more visible. This doesn't solve everything, but what we've done is we went from our traditional CV over here on the left, which promotes bean counting, hides content and contribution, ignores work product, to something that's more expansive and provides much more context, and that's our annotative format. And within our annotative format, we provide line items for people to document things like their efforts towards reproducibility. We provide an option for them to document the contribution of the work. That's the last bullet point here, which gives you an opportunity to say how this work might address societal problems, how it might address historically underrepresented groups, how it might contribute to diversity, equity, inclusion, and could even relate to training goals, right? In this particular paper, I did this work with a bunch of undergraduates, and we were interested in doing a replication project. And so, in that contribution, I get to say something about, this project actually had a broader goal than just reproducing a prior experiment. It involved some training. Okay, so now the critical part is, how did we do it? Well, first thing we did is we established some principles around which the reform will take place. Instead of relying on opinion or assertion or assumption, we actually leveraged data and consensus reports. I used intentional strategies to build awareness, engagement, and support. I won't go into each one of these values, but we felt that ultimately I felt that these values were so important that I wanted to have them immortalized in our criteria. So if you open up our criteria, you'll see the overarching principles and that guided our work. So number one, I made sure I did my work. We did research up front. We pulled in National Academy's reports on research integrity, open science, and reproducibility. I reviewed a ton of literature on bibliometrics and their usefulness. Actually ended up publishing a paper on this with a second paper underway. Reviewed consensus reports on faculty evaluations, including the Declaration on Research Assessment, a paper by Moyer and a bunch of other folks on evaluation systems. And then we looked at data on other inequities and sources of inequities. Processes and strategies. One of the first things I did was I got cleared by my dean and provost. They were highly supportive. It was nice to find surprising allies in high places. Ultimately, this was a pretty easy way to do. And it was nice to be able to go back to them and say, hey, do you still support this? And they would always say yes. the real heavy work, though, was with laying the groundwork. And this is where I spent most of my time, and where I realized that I really needed to spend some time sharing information with my faculty. So I had weekly emails I sent out, which are what I called the Friday email from the chair, or Friday nightcap from the chair. And in it, I would usually include a little snippet related to the overall mission. And sometimes these things would be intentionally built to engage faculty with the actual content. So I would use ice cream contests to bribe people to look up things on the web on their own and report back to me what they find. I leverage the power of repetition. Nothing convinces people like saying something over and over and over again. So, if you have something good to say, it's nothing wrong with saying it over again. And of course, create those reinforcing vectors. In terms of getting faculty on board, rather than starting with the whole faculty, which I learned from a false start wasn't going to work, I created a small, diverse working group that really focused on people who I thought were going to be easily persuadable, but might not necessarily have been in my camp. I didn't really bother to waste time on people I knew who were going to be on board. And I waited until I had sufficient buy-in to really start talking to the power brokers who I thought might want to push back, which were relatively few in my department, I will say. And then I incorporated my department feedback very strategically. Once we got a draft of our document, we started with our young faculty. We met with them, got their input, incorporated it, then went to our associate faculty, and then went to our full faculty. So by the time it got to the traditional power brokers, as you will, most of the pieces were in place. And one of the things we know from behavioral science is it's easier to put stuff in than it is to take stuff out. So we wanted to make sure the good stuff was in, and leverage what we know about behavioral science to make sure that we could keep it there. A couple of other strategies, I did most of the heavy lifting, which people enjoyed. And we also minimized threat. So we didn't want to, shut off pathways. This slide mostly just restates everything I just said, but I want to highlight one thing, and that is in this box here. So if you're going to do this and you want to try to roll this out yourself, I really think it's important to take a very broad-based view. About the time that we started going through this process, of course, the world was going through a reckoning with the murder of George Floyd. And so a lot of other issues were popping up at the same time. And this really ended up helping to inform a lot of what we ultimately did. And the whole purpose sort of broadened out, quite frankly, by virtue of these contemporary issues. And so ultimately, we wanted to consider the historical, how the historical approaches created systemic barriers to promotion, to engaging, to being part of the academy. We wanted to value community engaged work. We wanted to focus on real world societal impact. We wanted to think about how our changes would achieve anti-racism objectives. And then also how open science can advance diversity and equity inclusion in certain very specific ways, impacts through access and enhanced inclusion. And that's it. So thank you.
No, thank you so much for that presentation, Mike. I think there were a lot of really interesting points that you make. Let's open it up to the participants for questions. And a reminder to our participants, you can enter questions into the Q&A box. And we have some already. So, Mike, one question was, your experience was very positive as it's related in your presentation. But aside from taking the time and the energy to implement, did you encounter any impediments or pushback?
I have a fairly agreeable faculty. And I don't know if that's highly unique to my department, but I experienced relatively little pushback. There were a few people who said, well, but the way I went through it, right? Really thinking about, well, I had a certain process. This was the process I experienced, and therefore everybody should experience the same awful process. I inserted the word awful. That was really sort of the scope of the pushback. Now, there were a couple of impediments. I alluded to this false start that I had early on. And this was me thinking I could probably move this forward more quickly than I could. But early on, I tried to initiate some change and really my starting point was working from our existing draft and trying to make modifications. And what I found was so long as people already had a starting point, they were going to anchor on everything that we've been doing in the past and not move off of that anchor. And so when I ended up redoing it, had a restart on this whole process. By the way, the pandemic interrupted us midway, which ended up being kind of fortuitous because it allowed me to restart this process. What we did was we started from a blank slate. I threw out the old ones. They were awful, by the way. I mean, I was almost embarrassing for me to send these to faculty for review. So it was primarily positive, though I will say, what I won't call it negative, but I will say that my early experience was faculty were so anchored on historical ways of doing things that they just couldn't think about new ways of doing it. And then so I realized I got some work to do first.
Great, thank you. One question that came in is, have the efforts of your department stimulated interest and or imitation by others in the university, or maybe in other universities that you've shared this work with?
Depends on what you mean by imitation. I've run a number of workshops at this point, and there's a lot of interest in, I don't know if mimicking what we've done is the right way of describing it, but there's a lot of interest at other places, as well as other departments here at Maryland, of changing the way they do things. The biggest piece of feedback I get is that people are worried. I think it really comes down to those traditional power brokers. Like, we've been doing it for so long. How will it be perceived by outside entities, right? Or how will it be perceived by senior colleagues? And so what I can say is that there have been a number of other departments who have borrowed our documents and have worked with them and have adopted some aspects of them. I don't think that I know of anyway that anybody who's undergone the whole scale change that we had. Remember, it took me 5 years. And so now that we have it completed, right, you can think about the next person who wants to do it is going to have to spend a fair amount of legwork educating, socializing before they're going to be able to make changes.
Right. So another question is, what do you say to those who say that their basic research is geared to societal benefits, but it's not obvious in the short term? So in psychology, and I'm a psychologist as well, we've got a little bit of a leg up because we work with people in general, most of us. How about the research on mRNA several years ago that led to the development of COVID vaccines, et cetera?
Yeah, great example. And I'll just say that we did not change anything that was historical in the sense of valuing basic science, recognizing that for much of the work that scientists do, we may never see what the true benefit is in our lifetimes. And so we didn't shut that off. What we did was just provide an avenue for people to do work that could show more immediate and more sort of imminent focus on societal benefits. But we still have in our promotion criteria advancement of science, basic science. We've just added now that there's a way of doing your science that can also be society-based or have a more practical benefit in the short term. So still fully in line with the way we view things. This multiple paths to success is really the key.
Great. A common concern about this type of assessment is that it would require more time. Did you find that the time needed for assessment has changed?
We're in our second cycle of using these criteria for promotion cases. In some ways, yes. In other ways, it's so much more straightforward because I know exactly what I'm looking for when I'm looking through someone's dossier. Recently, I created a template for faculty doing like third-year reviews. And the immediate feedback I got from the people who were using was that it was super helpful to be able to do a sort of guided assessment based on not a rubric, but a template for the aspects of what we want to sort of look through look for in the third year review. So yeah, it probably takes a little more time, but we're talking about someone who we're committing significant resources to, and in some cases, many cases, lifetime positions.
Well, as a follow-up, so you knew exactly what you were looking for, but you were an intimate part of the process, right? So how did you or would you communicate with external reviewers about your departmental policy, or do you have any lessons around that?
Yeah, so that is still a bit of a work in progress, because as I started out with, people have been doing it one way for so long, they have a hard time seeing other ways to do it. And as you might imagine, when people are reviewing candidates, they might just not bother reading a set of criteria, or kind of just peek through them. And so they're going to do the things that they're going to do. What I can say is sort of a backstop to that is that the nice thing about the criteria is that we have to judge people by the criteria. We can't use things that aren't in the criteria for making a determination of someone's merit or a determination of someone's tenurability. It has to be in the criteria. And so external reviewers are going to do what the external reviewers do. In some cases, they'll read the criteria carefully and respond to them. In other cases, they may not read it so carefully and write what they normally are going to write. And then it's just a matter of rectifying whatever sort of disparities there are with that. And that's a responsibility of the committee, and it's a responsibility of the department chair to point those things out, which I don't mind doing.
Great. As you've gone through this process and talked to others, what kinds of things have emerged that science policy at a national level, or associations, or national organizations could do to support these kinds of bottom-up efforts?
Yeah, that's a great question. So number one, I've been working pretty closely with the Higher Education Leadership Initiative in Open Science. It's heliosopen.org. And their whole mission is really to, one component is the incentive systems, but it's really about broadening access to science and scholarship. So making data accessible, making scholarship accessible, changing policies to promote accessibility. Really, it's a sort of broad-based effort. And so we've been working, or I've been working with them through the University of Maryland to sort of help, as much as I can to do this. Also with other sort of societies. So I think, part of this is about socializing the policies and socializing the efforts beyond the department. And there have been some opportunities to do that. I don't know if I'm actually answering the question, but I guess the point being that there is definitely a need for societies to be engaged, for departments to be engaged, and universities to be engaged. A lot of the signaling needs to come down from these organizations to say, this is important, we support it, and it's in line with our values.
Well, let me follow up with that in terms of, were there any specific aspects of the org structure at UMD that helped this effort succeed, or that one might be looking for in an institution in terms of support structures of administrators or other aspects, research offices, so forth?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So one thing I learned is that our associate provost for faculty affairs was very clear about this. They rely on departments here at Maryland. They rely on departments to develop the criteria. So unless we came to them with something really crazy, they were going to be supportive, and they are beholden to our criteria. They can't say, oh, well, we don't agree with the psychology department's criteria, so therefore we're going to make our own evaluation at the college level or at the university level. They have to follow the criteria that have been put in place at the department level. And so that was actually an enabler, right? Because it meant that there were no barriers other than making sure that I wasn't going to violate some other university policy somewhere.
So, and this will be the last question before you go ahead and make some last observations. Your university leaders and administrators were not barriers, but are there things that they could specifically and explicitly take to encourage more of these types of efforts?
Yeah, I think One thing I've learned is that many upper level administrators are looking for the departments to do this from the ground up. And one of the things I learned also is that many faculty are kind of waiting for the administrators to signal their approval. And so if I had to point to one thing that would be really, really important, it's that, having administrators, they don't have to mandate, oh, hey, you have to do this, but signaling that they are open and supportive of these types of reform issues would be huge. Because quite frankly, one of the things that I hear frequently is, well, we don't know if we can do this. And that was a question my faculty had. Are we allowed is the question I got. And I assured them we were allowed. But it would be nice if there were administrators who were more vocal about giving their support in very specific ways.
Yeah, I think that the major innovation that you undertook in this process is that you went ahead and did it, right? And you went ahead and said, hey, let's think a little bit differently about it and let's go ahead and do it. And then you've got this, great example of what you've done there. So why don't you go ahead? I'll give you just a couple minutes to offer any final takeaway messages that you have.
Sure thing. I'm going to pull up some slides. First, summary of what I learned. I already gave you my summary. Faculty want to do the right thing. So don't let being worried about what your faculty are going to say be the thing that prevent you from doing it. Okay. Yeah, we've been doing it for so long, but we can get people to imagine another way. It does take some time and effort, but the payoff is huge. And I can say that my faculty who were engaged with this, my small little committee, they came to me and they said, A, Mike, you were right. This was fun. And B, you were right. You did all the work. And C, they view it as one of the more meaningful things they've done at the University of Maryland. All three of them were really, really proud of what we accomplished. And I just want to reiterate, administrators are open. So don't think that they're gonna say no. The culture at Maryland has been very supportive. They say yes. I should say they rarely say no to anything. And so, we don't have a culture of no. We have a culture of get out and get it done. And that as sort of underlying this sort of movement in our department, I think was really encouraging. The other thing I want to end with is, an open invitation. Hopefully my colleagues at the Open Research Funders Group, Greg Tannenbaum, Aaron McKiernan, and Caitlin Carter won't roast me for this, but we've been running some workshops with various organizations, most of them within psychology. If anybody wants to do this at your institution, or if you want to do it through your society, please reach out to me or one of the other folks at the Open Research Funders Group. We would be happy to do this. So an open invitation. Please feel free to email me or reach out. Otherwise, material are available at OSF. Good luck.
Well, thank you so much, Mike, and thank you to everybody who attended today's webinar.